A body once revered now lay twisted in the suffocating gloom of the royal bedchamber, marked by an agony so profound that it seemed to press the very air flat and lifeless. The king's pain became a silent force within the palace walls, an invisible pall that drove even the most hardened courtiers to the edge of faintness, the air itself thick with a stench so powerful it blurred the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of rot. After death, the horror did not subside. It lingered as fluids from the king's ruined flesh seeped from his coffin, vanishing into the cold flagstones, or lapped up by scavenging dogs in the night, a final wordless indignity for a sovereign who had once inspired terror and awe throughout Christendom. Such was the end of Henry VIII, a monarch whose life and death became the dark mirror of the kingdom he shaped. His last chapter so grotesque and haunting that it is rarely spoken of except in hushed, uneasy tones. Yet the nightmarish decline of this king began far from darkness, in the radiant promise of youth. Henry Tudor entered the world on a summer's day, June 28, 1491, a prince of legend in the making. When he claimed the throne at 17, his presence filled Europe's courts with rumors of a new golden age. Tall and broad, his hair a burnished copper gold, he strode through the palaces like a figure conjured from myth, his every gesture watched and envied. A Venetian ambassador, awed by this vision of royal vigor, declared Henry possessed an extraordinary figure and angelic countenance surpassing every Christian prince in beauty. But splendor is no shield against time, and the world would soon witness the slow undoing of this paragon. The pivot came with a single catastrophic moment, January 1536. Beneath the wintry sky of Greenwich, Henry, then 44, entered the lists for a joust, only for fate to betray him. His horse collapsed, crushing the king and rendering him senseless for hours. Though he survived, the price was written in flesh. His right leg, mangled beyond the skill of Tudor medicine, never truly healed. It became an ever-bleeding wound, weeping and putrid its foulness, traveling ahead of him like a spectral herald. For a king who had ruled by image and presence, the humiliation was profound. Courtiers trapped in this world of enforced reverence dared not betray revulsion. To flinch at the odor was to risk the king's unpredictable wrath. So they endured, breathing shallowly, eyes downcast, as the king's shadow grew darker. It was more than a bodily wound. Something within Henry shifted as well. The year of his accident was also the year he unleashed the machinery of accusation against Anne Boleyn, his second queen, sending her to her death on charges no one dared question aloud. Some would whisper later that the fall had jarred loose not only bone but reason, accelerating the king's paranoia and violence, setting him on a path where fear reigned and mercy withered. Trapped by pain, stripped of mobility, Henry began to swell with unnatural speed. The trim waist admired in youth ballooned grotesquely, and soon his frame exceeded all proportions known at court. Over 180 kilograms, he could no longer move freely. The halls were altered for him, doors widened, and a web of pulleys devised to lift and carry the king who had once strode the length of his kingdom. He became less a man than a burden for his household, to manage the palace itself, groaning under the weight of royal decline. The opulence of the royal table did nothing to arrest this fall. Kitchen accounts record a daily orgy of consumption platters of red meat, savory pies, rich sauces, while vegetables, those simple gifts of the earth, rarely touched his plate. It was as if Henry sought to vanquish his mortality by force of appetite, each feast a denial of the inevitable. But no amount of food could stave off the encroaching shadows. The king who had once embodied England's promise now became a living symbol of its fears, a man undone by hubris, by wounds both seen and hidden, waiting out his days in a world of flickering candlelight and prayers that seemed to echo unanswered against the stone. And all the while, beyond the locked doors and shrouded windows, the kingdom watched and waited uneasy in the hush that settles just before the end. A typical dinner in those waning years was a parade of excess platters, heaped high with steaming meat pies, goblets brimming with deep red wine, and flagons of strong ale. Each meal seemed less a celebration than an act of denial, the king seeking refuge in abundance as the walls of his existence pressed ever closer. Forced into near immobility, his once formidable frame withered beneath the velvet robes, the inertia hastening the decay that gnawed at him from within. The ulcers on his legs, born of old wounds and royal neglect, became chasms that refused to heal. Physicians, desperate and bewildered, subjected him to agonies masquerading as remedies, searing the flesh with hot irons, smearing on salves laced with arsenic and mercury, draining his veins in rituals of bloodletting that left him weaker with each passing day. The wounds grew monstrous. It was whispered that bone gleamed through ruined flesh, and the stench became a presence unto itself, lingering in tapestries and shadows so potent that courtiers recoiled from rooms still 3 doors away, even as duty demanded silence. In the suffocating gloom of the royal apartments, Henry, now nearing 50, took for his 5th wife the youthful Catherine Howard, a union he proclaimed as his return to vigor and happiness. Yet the spectacle was macabre, the aged, ruined king beside a bride not yet 20, her laughter brittle as candlelight in a crypt. Catherine, unable to bear the reality of her decaying consort, turned in secret to a courtier nearer her own age, searching for solace that the king could no longer provide. When whispers of betrayal reached his ears, the monarch's wrath shattered the thin veneer of courtly decorum. Swift, merciless retribution followed, and both lovers were sent to their deaths, leaving the palace colder still. His final marriage to Catherine Parr in 1543 bore little resemblance to the romantic fables of his youth. Catherine became nurse more than wife, moving through the oppressive corridors with measured compassion, tending to wounds that neither time nor medicine could heal. The ghosts of 6 queens haunted the hush of Henry's nights, and Catherine's kindness stood as both duty and warning in a place where affection so often preceded disaster. As the shadows deepened, the king's body became a battleground for afflictions without number. Modern scholars name diabetes, gout, hypertension, and the relentless drag of heart failure among the enemies within, though others whisper syphilis, a rumor contested by history but emblematic of the rot that now defined him. Every hour was a war between agony and numb despair. Fits of rage thundered through the palace, echoing off stone and bone, followed by stretches of torpor in which Henry was little more than a motionless specter lost to pain and memory. Suffering sharpened his paranoia until it became a constant shadow at his side. The brilliance that once guided England through storms of politics and faith turned inward, curdling into suspicion and fear. Loyal friends and wise counselors, those who had braved the king's moods for decades, now found themselves condemned by nothing more than a glance or a rumor. In the twilight of his reign, Henry VIII became not just a king besieged by enemies, but a solitary figure trapped in a kingdom of ghosts, haunted by betrayals both real and imagined, and by the inexorable closing of history's heavy door. A suffocating terror crept through the labyrinthine corridors of Henry's court, where every glance and whispered word carried the weight of mortal risk. Paranoia reigned as absolute as the monarch himself, and even the faintest hint of disloyalty could summon the specter of the scaffold. In his final days, the king's suspicions grew sharper than ever. It was not enough to fear his rivals. Now, all faces were masks and every servant a possible threat. Henry's dread turned deadly when he ordered the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, just days before his own demise, a last desperate assertion of power as the walls closed in. The fear of poison became a constant gnawing presence. Rituals of safety consumed each mealtime, servants forced to taste every dish. Each goblet and knife scrutinized, the simple act of eating transformed into a nightly dance with death. What began as caution soon curdled into obsession, the king's mind clouded by illness. or the cruel aftershocks of strokes, making reality itself tremble at the edge of his perception. With winter's return, the air in the palace thickened heavy with the stench of disease and the sour musk of failing flesh. Henry's world shrank to a bed surrounded by shadows and the mute, exhausted forms of those who still dared serve him. His body, ravaged by infection and decay, grew immobile, the agony in his legs blossoming into gangrene and announcing itself with an odor so overpowering that courtiers covered their faces with perfumed cloths, struggling to mask both the smell and their revulsion. Even the flicker of candlelight seemed to hesitate in these rooms, illuminating the silent choreography of attendants who moved through a realm grown airless and uncanny, their voices reduced to murmurs as they waited for the inevitable end. The king's decline became a silent spectacle, a ritual of denial and whispered prayers. Fever haunted his nights, twisting his breathing into a desperate struggle, while his mind slipped through half-lit corridors where past and present merged in confusion. In his fevered delirium, Henry called out for lost wives Jane Seymour, the only queen to give him a son, and then vanish into death's embrace. Anne Boleyn, whose tragic memory haunted the shadows. The names rose and fell with the uneven rhythm of his breath, echoing through the chamber like accusations and confessions alike, while the living watched powerless from the edge of his fading world. Yet within this gloom the court conspired in a final terrible silence. To speak the truth of the king's condition was itself a crime. Under English law, even to hint at the monarch's mortality was treason. So they clung to pretense, ministering to a body already succumbing to decay, voices bright with false hope as the air grew rank with the unmistakable scent of ending. And as the last winter pressed ever closer, the King of England lay captive to a body he could not command, and a court that dared not name his doom, every shadow stretching longer in the dying light of a dynasty. On a cold January night in 1547, the air in Henry's bedchamber was thick with shadows, and the press of a silent court waiting for the inevitable. Knowing the end drew near, Henry at last allowed Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to enter, summoned not by command, but by a kind of exhausted surrender. The king, once thunderous and unyielding, could no longer speak. Instead, when asked the final question of faith, he pressed Cranmer's hand with a faint and trembling grasp, his last conscious act, and perhaps the most vulnerable gesture of a life spent in pursuit of dominance. In the early hours of January 28th, at the age of 55, the breath that had dictated the fate of England faded from his lips, leaving only the echo of his passing in the silent, candle-lit gloom. Yet death brought no release from humiliation. Henry's colossal form, swollen by years of pain and appetite, defied the conventions of royal burial. A coffin had to be specially constructed, vast enough to contain not only his remains, but the physical evidence of a reign spent in excess. Embalmers grim and wary set about their work, the air growing heavier with the mingled scents of resin, wilted herbs, and the undertones of decay that could not be masked by ritual or prayer. The art of preservation, crude by the standards of later centuries, offered little dignity. The body was emptied, packed with aromatic plants, and sealed away behind wood and lead, but nothing could halt the ancient march of corruption. As the days dragged by and the court prepared for the spectacle of royal mourning, a darkness deeper than night crept into the chapel at Sion Abbey, where Henry's coffin lay in uneasy rest. In the half-light, something unthinkable occurred, a slow, silent seepage of death itself. The seal on the coffin, unable to contain the inevitable, surrendered to pressure from within. By morning, the flagstones beneath the casket gleamed with unearthly moisture, the evidence of a king's body dissolving into the very stones of his kingdom. It was here that chroniclers recorded a vision both pitiful and ominous, stray dogs drawn by the scent lapping at the fluids of royal decomposition. To witnesses, it was a scene so macabre that it echoed through the palace for generations, a final unanswerable insult to a king who had so obsessively guarded his majesty. The once omnipotent Henry, who had bent the church to his will, and sent wives to the block, was reduced to flesh and memory, defenseless against time and the lowliest of creatures. On February 16th, almost 3 weeks after death claimed him, the last act of Henry's royal theatre unfolded. The funeral, grand, somber, and nearly overwhelmed by the stench from within the coffin, marched forward with all the solemnity demanded by tradition. In the cold vault of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, beneath the ancient stone and flickering tapers, Henry was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him the son upon whom he had pinned the future of the realm. The irony of fate was merciless. Edward, the longed-for heir, would die in boyhood, his brief reign shadowed by illness. The throne would then pass to Mary Catherine of Aragon's daughter, whose devotion to the old faith sparked a brutal attempt to reverse her father's legacy. Only with Elizabeth Anne Boleyn's daughter would England step into an age of new brilliance, forged in the crucible of all that Henry had broken and remade. Yet none of this could lighten the shadow that lingered in the wake of the king's passing. The grotesque spectacle of Henry's death stood as a mute rebuke to the myth of invincibility. The man who declared himself above law and pope, who carved his will upon the souls of his people, was brought low by the simplest and most inescapable of truths, that the flesh fails, that power cannot forestall decay. His end was not merely the closing of a chapter, but the fading of an epoch, the slow hush that settles after the storm has passed. It was as historian Alison Weir would write one of history's bitterest ironies, that a prince born to promise beauty and boundless hope would die a solitary figure. His body deformed, his mind clouded, his name spoken more in fear than in love. The arc of Henry's life remains a testament to the dangers of unchecked power and the corrosive effects of suffering denied or left to fester. The king who split the church and set a nation on its turbulent new course could not in the end escape the frailty of his own mortality. It is this shadow, heavy, unyielding, and utterly human, that haunts the final images of Henry VIII, a world grown quiet, candles guttering before the altar, and at the center of it all, a throne left empty, waiting for history's judgment to fall as surely as night. The last moments of Henry's reign unfolded not in the thunder of triumph, but within the stifling hush of a darkened chamber where his labored breath haunted the air and his once mighty body lay twisted by pain and decay. Here the grandeur immortalized in regal portraits was stripped away, revealing a monarch reduced to flesh and weakness, an emperor not of destiny, but of suffering. Shadows pressed close, flickering candlelight painting his deformed features in wavering gold, as if the room itself recoiled from the spectacle of so much mortality. The silent attendants, wearied by weeks of anxious vigil, moved quietly in the gloom, bearing witness to the final dissonance between the legend of Henry VIII and the unvarnished truth of his decline. This jarring contradiction between the mask of majesty and the ruin of the man was the true lesson of his departure. Henry, who had reshaped England with iron will and stamped his legend across the fate of nations, was ultimately delivered not to glory, but to the ignominy of rot, the slow invasion of darkness and the helpless surrender that awaits all living things. His passing did not echo with the hymns of victory, but with the unbearable heaviness of a fate that mocked even the highest crown. There, in the thick air, the myth of royal invulnerability began to unravel. The divine institution, so long thought to hover above the reach of time and decay, was forced to kneel before the ancient laws of nature. Yet even as his body withered, Henry's own story spiraled into irony. The king who tore apart Christendom to secure a son would see that fragile heir lost to youth, his own legacy passing instead through daughters, the most enduring of whom, Elizabeth, was born of the queen he condemned with a pen and a lie. The shadows that gathered around Henry's deathbed whispered not just of endings, but of judgment, of the hubris that drove him to defy both church and nature, and of the immutable boundaries he could never cross. In his last hours, surrounded by the murmurs of last rites and the shifting candlelight, Henry became less a sovereign and more a symbol, a stark reminder that all power, no matter how absolute, must yield before the slow, relentless unraveling of the flesh. It was not merely a historical event, but a ritual of closure. The king's passing marked the end of an age, the fall of illusion, and the final triumph of mortality over might. The body, once sculpted to embody royalty itself, became a silent warning, its decay, a testament to the brevity of all earthly splendor, its silence echoing the truth that even the greatest are but shadows awaiting dusk. In that gloom, court and country alike felt the tremor of a world left suddenly uncertain, the empty throne standing as both accusation and omen. The tale of Henry's final decline continues to chill and compel, not for its spectacle of horror, but for the revelation it offers. Behind the gilded facade of supremacy lies a soul condemned to share the common fate of all. In his ruin we glimpse the secret fragility of kings, and in the quiet aftermath the whispered certainty that before death's patient hand every crown is merely borrowed, and every ruler, no matter how terrible, must finally stand equal with the smallest of his subjects.